We're coming up on 10 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oops, sorry. So, Nana Bonjour. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in our 61st episode of the Clements Bookworm in celebration of Native American Heritage Month. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. Today's meeting is being recorded to share online. This afternoon, you will receive an email with the recording and resources mentioned in today's broadcast. Just in case you haven't joined us before for the Bookworm, I want to let you know that we encourage you to use the chat. We're happy to have you chime in. Please change the setting to everyone so that your comments are shared with the entire group. My colleagues Ann Bennington-Helber and Helen Harding will be monitoring the chat and pasting other information in there. Just so you know, you will receive a recording later with the links that are shared in the chat, so you don't have to necessarily worry about them, but I know sometimes it's nice to have them right away. That being said, the chat goes by very quickly, so use the Q&A section to ask questions. You can also see the questions that other people have and give it a thumbs up to upvote it. We do, as part of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program, have the live machine captions turned on. You can toggle those on or off and change the size of the font. And in addition, we do have side-by-side mode enabled, which should allow you to see both the slides and the speaker, but you have control over how much. So move the separator and play with that a little bit. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of history and culture of North America and the Caribbean to about 1900. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library also acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. We are about to close the poll question. So if you haven't participated yet, click very quickly. And I'm going to end the poll and share the results. We thought it would be fun to ask if any of you had books that were printed on something other than paper. And I see that the majority have said no, but that we do have a handful of people with books printed on something else. So we'd love to hear more about those in the chat. And thank you for participating. Each year, the Multi-Ethnic Student Affairs Department and Native American Student Association collaborate with campus partners to bring a wide range of events that celebrate Native American culture So what you see here are some upcoming events, and we're happy to partner with them on this event and hope that you have a chance to check out some of the other events and recordings. In addition, today's Bookworm program is generously sponsored by the Alumni Association of the University of Michigan, and we thank them so much for their partnership in these programs. Today, we're exploring the life and works of Simon Pokagon, author and prominent member of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians. Simon Pokagon's captivating stories were preserved through the unique medium of birch bark. Paul Erickson, the Randolph G. Adams Director of the Clements Library, will join in the conversation. So I'll turn the program over to Paul to introduce today's guests.
Thank you so much, Angela, and I'm really excited about today's program. This is something that I've been looking forward to for a long time, and I want to specifically highlight the work of Kelly Wisecup at Northwestern University, who helped bring the Clements into this conversation and has been sort of central to moving this project forward. But I want to welcome today's guests, who we're really delighted to have with us. First, Blaire Morseau is a citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians and assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Michigan State University, where she also teaches in American Indian and Indigenous Studies. In October 2023, so just like a couple of weeks ago, she released an edited volume featuring the collection of antique birch bark books written by 19th century Potawatomi author Simon Pokagon, titled As Sacred to Us, Simon Pokagon's Birch Bark Stories in Their Context, published by Michigan State University Press, which features contributions from several members of the University of Michigan library staff. Her research interests are in Indigenous science fiction and futurisms, traditional culture and ecological knowledge, digital heritage, and native countermapping. She's currently working on a new book project tentatively titled Mapping Anishinaabe Futures, under contract with the University of Arizona Press. Our second guest today is Fritz Swanson, who's the director of the Wolverine Press here at the University of Michigan. He's a writer, teacher, and printmaker, and is the founding editor of The Index, a quarterly letterpress experience. He's also a founder of the Printing Stewards, a nonprofit dedicated to the preservation of traditional metal typecasting. So I will turn things over to Blaire.
Bonjour, Jayak, Blaire Morseau, Indigenous, mine mkokwe Anishinaabe noswin, Pokagonaniak and Bendagwes, mine mkona dodem. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here sharing this virtual space with you today. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians, as well as descendant of Grand River Band of Odawa in Michigan. And so while I'm an enrolled member of a tribe, I'm also predominantly of Scot-Irish ancestry, and I was born with the last name Caldwell. Morseau is my spouse's family name. And so I think it's important to situate myself kinship-wise, following an important and pervasive protocol in many Indigenous communities to put ourselves in relation to community, clan, family. And so I'm excited to be sharing a recent book project with you, containing the transcriptions of small birch bark books published by Simon Pokagon at the end of the 19th century and posthumously at the beginning of the 20th century. I'll present on the Pokagon Potawatomi Tribal Archives, where the specific birch bark books I've helped preserve, steward, and share with community are held, and how they have inspired new conversations and insights about Potawatomi relationships to important places in Michigan, as well as insights into the Potawatomi language, what we call Bodwewadmimwem. So much of those linguistic insights are shared by contributors to As Sacred to Us volume, fellow Pokagon citizens Bemedwin Kyle Malott and Corinne Casper. I'll also briefly share some of the new research by another one of the contributors, Dr. Kelly Wisecup, and what she shares in the text about the sort of syndicated print networks Simon utilized back when he decided to publish these works over a century ago. And finally, I hope to demonstrate how, despite Simon's rocky reputation within the Pokagon community, his political advocacy demonstrates what I call a form of Anishinaabe futurity that reclaims Indigenous homelands and the stories and ontological relationships Anishinaabe have to those places, while simultaneously carving out space for Indigenous survivance in the future, despite claims then, and sometimes even today, of our inevitable extinction. So if you could advance to the next slide, please. So normally I talk about this text also in relation to a second pillar of the project, which included the recordings of Pokagon band members actually reading these stories and making them more accessible to community, as well as non-native teachers, some of whom include elders, a couple contributors of this book, including Dr. John Lau at the Ohio State University. But if we have time in the Q&A, I'm happy to expand upon that project. So prior to the pandemic, if we can all remember such a time, I was doing ethnographic research and trained as a cultural anthropologist and writing my dissertation. So between the years 2017, 2020, I was working for my tribe as the first full-time archivist. Many of you have heard or indeed have held one of these birch bark books, as they are accessioned in a number of institutions around the country, including the University of Michigan, but also Newberry Library, the Smithsonian, New York Public Library, and more. So the most well-known, of course, being the Red Man's Rebuke, also called the Red Man's Greeting, published in 1893. But in this collection at the Pokagon Archives are his other three less well-known books, Potawatomi Book of Genesis, Algonquian Legends of Paw Paw Lake, Algonquian Legends of South Haven. And so the collection includes multiple materials related to or even created by Simon. And so it was purchased from the tribe in 2016, I believe, from an elderly man named Douglas Fisher, who was unable to provide, unfortunately, much provenance information about this collection because it was pretty impressive. Included a lot of the publications Simon wrote in Harper's Monthly Magazine, some handwritten material, things like that. And so in my role as archivist, I had to present at local history conferences and do a certain amount of outreach and relationship building with local museums and things. And so I presented on these birch bark books, how they became part of the tribal archives, talking about the newly established tribal archives more generally at the Michigan History Conference in 2018. And so that's when I was approached by the then editor-in-chief at MSU Press if I would be at all interested in perhaps working on a republication of these texts. And so, of course, we're in 2023 now. This was in 2018. It's been a little bit of time, but I had a baby. I was finishing my dissertation, working full-time. I was a little busy. So here we are. If you could advance slides, please. So carefully enveloped between the protective acid-free folders and locked behind the heavy door of a chilly archives room, the small size fitting in the palm of one's hand and the thinness of paper bounded by over 100-year-old green silk ribbon is a deceptive performance of delicacy and fragility. It's deceptive because these books made from the thin layers of bark of white birch trees are indeed strong and durable. As the author himself proclaims, this most remarkable tree with manifold bark used by us instead of paper, being of greater value to us as it could not be injured by sun or water. I should note, however, that in the It's Sacred to Us volume, there includes really interesting insights by conservatives Marika Kay at the University of Michigan, as well as Oa Sublom, about birch bark specific conservation methods that make it much different than how one might conserve regular books. Especially this is important insights given the fact that a lot of these birch bark books are held in archives rather than in perhaps ethnographic object collections. The Birch Bark books, both as a collection and on their own, are critical sources of 19th century intellectual thought, Indigenous intellectual thought. The content of Simon's writing insists on the validity of Indigenous spiritual beliefs, the importance of creation stories, as well as the love of land in the context of extreme dispossession and a particular brand of American racism at the time informed by the eugenics movement. So more than the sum of its parts, however, Simon's texts are not just quaint series that lament cultural and environmental loss, although they could be read as such. For instance, when Simon compares the disappearance of forests as a result of Michigan's logging industry to the disappearance of Native peoples. But alternatively, I argue that the Birch Bark books leverage Indigenous agency and make space for Anishinaabeg in the future, and thus comprise important interventions into Native literary studies and critical Indigenous theory. So Simon's Birch Bark books enact what I have described elsewhere as Anishinaabe futurisms, or Indigenous-made film, art, video games, literature, and even oral storytelling that draws from traditional knowledge to envision and convey alternative futures. So alternative to what, you might ask? Alternative to narratives that deployed by non-natives that primitivized our cultures or oversimplified our politics and placed us in an imagined past, unable to exist in modernity, let alone in the future, not only writing us out of history, but writing us out of the future. So Simon does all this resisting what might be called an anachronism that's been placed on Indigenous peoples, while disseminating stories that forefront Indigenous agency. But who was Simon Pokagon, and what was his role in the larger Indigenous community of the 19th century Great Lakes region? Next slide, please. So I'll continue with a little background on the individual for whom these Birch Bark stories are attributed. Simon Pokagon was a 19th century intellectual, author, activist. He was son of Odawa and Ojibwe leader Saquinik, also known as Pokagon, for whom my tribe gets their namesake, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, a federally recognized tribe, as you may know, in Michigan and Indiana in the United States. And so Saquinik has this name Pokagon because Pokagon is translated into English as rib. And if you think about what our ribs do for our internal organs, they're known as, they protect our internal organs. And so Pokagon is known as a sort of protector of his village and his community. Of course, many of you know that he advocated for, in the Treaty of Chicago, for our villages to not be subject to removal, unlike other bands of Potawatomi. And Simon's mother was Potawatomi Katese, and she was the daughter of another Potawatomi leader, Dokmabe, which means he or she sits quietly. And so you kind of see at this time a naming convention starting to emerge, which goes from having a singular name that you're known by, perhaps a ceremonial name or a name that you earn later on in life because of activities you do on behalf of your community or what have you, to the sort of compulsory surname or family name. In this case, when Saquinik or Pokagon is baptized, he becomes Leopold Pokagon. Similarly, Elizabeth takes on the last name of her father. Topnaby becomes Elizabeth Topnaby. And I should note that this sketch over here of Katese is actually not her. It's an unnamed Potawatomi woman. And I believe this comes from a sketch by George Winter that I decided to include because it just seemed better than not having an image at all. So these are his parents. And so you can see he has this tribal, heterogeneity within his identity. Simon's father, as you know, Saquinik was baptized Leopold Pokagon, and as some scholars and community members might argue, perhaps as a strategic move to appropriate a Catholic identity in the face of 1820s and 30s Indian removal in the Great Lakes region. So next slide, please. a complicated figure. Simon Pokagon is often referred to in early 20th century texts and periodicals as, quote, the last hereditary chief of the Potawatomi. Indeed, some of the birch bark books are ascribed to Chief Pokagon. Customarily, however, Potawatomi communities have complex, traditionally defined leadership roles, and hereditary chief is not one of them. What is more, his notoriety marked him as somewhat of a showboat by other Potawatomis because they felt that Pokagon perhaps was masquerading his Indianness to curious Victorian white folks. I've even heard the term used, fraud, by an elder in our community to describe Simon. And so another Pokagon Potawatomi scholar, John Lau, refers to this sort of reputation that he is cast as both hero and villain. And so it becomes a little bit complicated. And so everything we do, even today, is done within a complex web of relationships that require us to seek counsel, ask permission, know our place, and practice a certain level of humility. Of course, none of us are perfect, but given these cultural protocols, you might be able to see how when someone consistently violates perhaps those values and expectations, it can create animosities and imbalance with respect to your political standing within the tribe. Another important point that Lau makes within his book Imprints about the Potawatomi connection to Chicago is he talks about, I believe he references James Clifford, who was an anthropologist working with the Pokagon band back in the 80s and published a book about us. And I think it was within that there was a suggestion or perhaps even statement by Clifford that Simon Pokagon had a ghostwriter of his texts. And so since then, the rumor kind of proliferated that he perhaps wasn't the author of these birch bark books, but hopefully I can convince you otherwise. But nevertheless, despite this sort of rocky reputation within the community, even today, Simon Pokagon was an important intellectual, activist, and writer. He was born sometime in 1830 near Bertrand, Michigan, and died on January 28th, 1899 in Hartford, Michigan. He married Laudenal Angeline, for whom he dedicated his most famous work, Ogimakwe Mitigwaki, or Queen of the Woods. And Pokagon's writing resisted common misconceptions about Native Americans, such as labels of savagery and godlessness, among others I've previously mentioned, advocating for the rights of the environment, reclaiming Indigenous spaces in Michigan throughout the Great Lakes, and insisting that these spaces and these stories attached to those spaces are, again, quote, as sacred to us as holy writ to the white race, hence the title of the volume. And so he did all of this on small, thin birch bark paper, carefully peeled from white birch trees, split by hand into smaller leaflets and cut into pocket-sized squares, and curiously prepared for the printing press, something that I'm excited that Fritz is going to be sharing with us in a little bit. It was a thoroughly obscure process until Weisskopf's research included in a chapter of the edited volume. And so similar to Queen of the Woods, the birch barks weave Bodwe Wadminwen, the Potawatomi language, between primarily English sentences within the stories, with the exception of rebuke, which only has 2 Potawatomi words in them, one for God and one for devil, which is interesting. Next slide, please. And so he's pretty explicit in the rebuke, also known as the greeting, about why he decides to use birch bark. There's actually a much longer history to this, even within the literature, but it can come up in the Q&A if we'd like. So he talks about the sort of traditional uses of birch bark, or what we call wigwas, for things like canoes or boxes and baskets, as well as a host of other things. And he says, out of this bark of this wonderful tree were made hats, caps, and dishes for domestic use, while our maidens tied with it the knot that sealed their marriage vow. Wigwams were made of it, as well as large canoes that outrode violent storms on lake and sea. So next slide, please. It's interesting to note too, because while there is interesting conversations about how copyright is maintained, as well as C.H. Engel being the publisher, there's also the question about how this birch bark was harvested, and not just in terms of what the techniques are, but who is doing this work. Some of what we found suggests that perhaps women, unnamed Indigenous women, are doing this work and preparing the papers, cutting them, splitting them. Because this sort of curio souvenir art market has already existed at this time. And so some of the questions remain about the role of artisans, especially women, in this process. There's another research project here somewhere, so I hope someone takes this up. And here's an image you can see of how birch bark is harvested from the tree, and from the teachings and insights shared by artists such as Kelly Church. They say that as long as you don't harvest from a tree, the same tree, more than once, this doesn't damage or kill white birch. They're able to grow back in certain areas. So if you could advance to the next slide, please. So while not explicitly mentioned in his texts, Pokagon's use of birch paper to print his works also hints to traditional uses of birch bark, or what we call weekwas again. And so here are some examples of some of those pieces of artwork. Most of these birch barks paper are used. There's a couple different seasons when it's appropriate to harvest birch bark. And so you do different things with them depending on the season that you get it. And so in the summertime, you can harvest birch bark that is more easily peeled into thin layers, something that would be appropriate for the book. Whereas in the winter, you would want to harvest birch bark if you're looking for the darker tannins, so that you can do something like this middle image and etch different designs onto the laminate structure of the birch bark. And so this first image here of a turtle was made by Kelly Church, who's Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe. And she, this is made in a similar way that you might fold a piece of paper and cut out a design for a snowflake, but instead this birch bark is folded and it's bitten in such a way that you create a design. I've already explained how etching is done. And then finally, here is a book that's also accessioned in the Pokagon archives of a birch bark book that has quill work featured on it. I should also note that in the same way that Pokagon decided to leverage Potawatomi and larger Indigenous politics through the printing networks by using these birch bark books, this also points to a longer history of Anishinaabeg transcribing oral stories onto birch bark paper, so in pictograph form, so that they could be relayed later. Sometimes this is used in secular context, for lack of a better word, but also in ceremonial contexts. Next slide. So here is a brief look at some of the contributor essays of the folks who are involved in this, leading to insights both about language, but also geology, with specific reference to Algonquian legends of Paw Paw Lake, the ways in which the printing was done, as well as conservation recommendations for how to handle and preserve these books. Next slide, please. So Pokagon's text tells stories that add a richness to the understanding of where the tribe came from as Anishinaabeg. He reminds readers who are largely non-native, when these were first published and sold as souvenirs, of the original Indigenous place names that they now occupy. One important one being Chicago, or Chicago, meaning wild onion or leek. And here you can see, or perhaps you can't see, unfortunately, is a very sort of not clear picture of a 19th century set type. It's an unknown set type that shows the Chicago River meandering through what looks to be an Indigenous village with Native people in canoes on the river, and it's captioned "Chicago in my grandfather's day." I think it's interesting. Wisecup refers to this sort of set type and the images that are used in the books at this time as a form of 19th century clip art. Next slide, please. Another example is Kitchi Gitagan, referenced in Algonquian legends of Paw Paw Lake and transcribed by him as Earthly Paradise, though as language specialist Kaya Malat explains, Earthly Paradise is largely a romanticized translation, as the contemporary spelling Kitchi Gitagan literally means a big garden. And so it's here I'd like to just check in with timing and make sure that we have enough time for conversation with Fritz. How am I doing on time? Should I try to wrap things up or?
I think we're doing fine, right, Angela?
Yes, I agree. And
Okay.
Please keep going.
Okay, I just want to make sure there's enough time for conversation as well as Q&A. Next slide, please. So in using this linguistic construction, Pokagon also leverages the events, stories, and traditional knowledge tied to those names in his writings. In that sense, he reclaims indigenous places in Michigan that have erased native presence from areas such as South Haven, or what we would call Nicanong, or Beautiful Sunset, as well as Niles and Dowajoyuk, or Place of Harvesting. Next slide. In Algonquian legends of Paw Paw Lake, which is probably one of my favorite stories in this collection, Simon relays a story that he says Potawatomi people inherited from what he calls an ancient tribe of Anishinaabe. And he refers to them as prairie people who built large earthen mounds and who were driven out of that specific area by Odawa folks. And so in the story, there's a village near what he calls a great inland bay. It suddenly falls away and the flood banks fail in what geologists today would call a glacial outburst event. And so this sort of phenomenon was actually quite common, we're starting to find out, during the end of the last ice age, and tends to leave scars on the landscape. The most famous example is actually Missoula, Montana, wherein a catastrophic flood bank failure led to the flooding of the northwest coast of the US, an event Native people likely witnessed. And in the case of Michigan, we kept stories about it. These stories, mind you, being thousands of years old. If we could advance to the next slide, please. So here's where we talk about a little bit of the controversy of the language that he uses, specifically in the forms of, I say Anishinaabe as a sort of larger umbrella term for the language, because as linguists and Potawatomi language speakers have indicated, what he uses isn't Potawatomi per se, but Simon's use of language is unique, to say the least, because Ojibwe, or he blends what are often understood as separate dialects, Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe in his writings. So this linguistic heterogeneity may have actually been quite common. Potawatomi is already known to share a similar grammatic structure with Ojibwe and Odawa. And it also has Sauk influences, Miamia influences within the language, but he also blends occasional Odawa words. And the fact that kinship-wise, Simon was of, quote, mixed ancestry, that is Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe, perhaps these code shifts were not an exception within what was being spoken at that time in villages, but more of a rule. And so, more than that, though, there are some issues for someone who grew up speaking Anishinaabe. His publications contain errors that, according to language specialists, a native speaker would simply not make. And these are more than just typos, because obviously over time we tend to spell things differently, especially when you don't have a certain writing system established. Things are pronounced differently, but it misses possessive markers. Sometimes the grammatical structure is totally incorrect. It seems to be forcing native words to fit an English grammatical structure in something that we call nouning. So, you know, Potawatomi and related languages are very verb and descriptive heavy, whereas English is very noun heavy, and it sort of violates the structure in order to just sort of put these or force these native words into these sentences. And so, because of some of this, there is controversy over language use and claims to ghostwriting, or at the very least, a heavy-handed editor who perhaps was where Simon was dictating these stories, someone was typing them up, and this person who was typing them up was not knowledgeable of Algonquian languages. But a really interesting set of points and insights by Pokagon linguist Corinne Casper suggests a couple of things. One is assuming that his use of language wasn't purposeful. There's some evidence to suggest that because Ojibwe was being documented much more than Potawatomi was back in this time, especially by missionaries, priests, and the dissemination of booklets for catechisms and hymns, Ojibwe might have taken on this idea of being more sophisticated, or at least that this is the Indigenous Algonquian dialect that is visible within the literature already. So a purposeful publishing of that as well. But then also it has this idea of it being a language ideology, right? Seeing Ojibwe as more sophisticated. There's nothing inherently sophisticated about it, at least in relation to Potawatomi, but the way things are seen matter. And then finally, she talks about Pokagon's important political work in terms of perhaps him seeing how language documentation is not only a form of recognition of saying this language exists, therefore these people exist, and lending to a form of sovereignty. And so Pokagon wanting to advance this work on behalf of his community in Southwest Michigan by including our language in these printed works. So a sort of documentary evidence that leads to sovereignty as a form of political work. Corinne argues that Pokagon didn't use Ojibwe phrases and spellings because he simply didn't know Potawatomi that well, as some have suggested, but likely because Ojibwe was, and in some ways still is, seen as more sophisticated, more widely used in professional spaces and official documents, lending to, again, this form of language ideology. And so what you see here on the right is an item from the Newberry Library in Chicago of catechisms and hymns in the Potawatomi language. And so if there's something folks want to see more of, I'm happy to share this resource later on. So if we could advance the next slide, please. Talk very briefly about the Red Man's Rebuke and the Red Man's Greeting, because many of you know about this already. It's a pretty well-known text, has been published by many people, but you might be thinking, rebuke to what? Of course, we know that being published in 1893, it's a rebuke to the World's Fair, which is a celebration of American modernity, right? If you could advance to the next slide. So Indigenous peoples, again, are seen as anachronisms that don't belong in the present because of their primitiveness, and certainly don't belong in the future. And so this is such important political work as having this rebuke that was disseminated at the World's Fair, but interestingly was actually disseminated at the New York at the New York Book Fair a little earlier of that same year. And so what Wisecup describes is what's going on here is that he brought Indigenous environmental and artistic knowledge into relation with communication practices that US audiences associated with modernity. Next slide, please. Another birch bark book featured in this collection is Potawatomi Book of Genesis, which describes the creation of original man and woman as being molded out of red clay, emerging from a lake. And it's interesting to note that similar tribes are sort of like cousin tribes to us, including the Meskwaki. Literally, if you break down their name, Mesqua meaning red, Aki being earth or clay. Next slide. And so this has nothing to do with my research, but I thought it was an interesting piece to share. But no, it is related. So what you're seeing here is an artist who decided to make a Mandalorian armor set, which of course we know comes from the Star Wars series and is made of the traditional birch bark material that we're known for. And so I always appreciate ways that Indigenous ingenuity is placed in conversation with things that we all find interesting, whether it's in pop culture or science fiction, because what's traditional evolves over time and it's in relation to what our needs and our desires are. And so as someone who writes about Indigenous science fiction, I'm interested in the ways that communities co-produce narratives and imagining of possible futures. And I see sort of like Madoc Saltzman, who's also written about this, that political advocacy and perhaps protest is one form of Indigenous futurity, where storytelling, artwork is the creative pillar used to support and advance Indigenous conceptions of the future. And so with my final slide, I just have a discount code to share with you if you'd like to purchase the the Sacred to Us text. You can use the QR code it will take you to MSU Press, and you can use one of these discount codes in that. And so here's where I'd like to segue to Fritz and ask a couple of questions specifically about the printing process. And so, Fritz, you point out on your website that the book says by Simon Pokagon and C.H. Engel as publisher. But the question is, who did what parts, which parts exactly? And so I was wondering if you could say more about that. And if there's time, I'd also love for you to tell us a little bit more about the set types, or what Weisskopf refers to as the 19th century clip art that is featured in some of the birch bark books, and also a little bit about the specific printing press that was believed to be used in publishing these works.
Yeah, hi. First of all, thank you to Paul for inviting me. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk about this stuff. And thank you to Blaire. That was such a wonderful introduction to that, to what I did, and I really enjoyed your talk. So thank you. Yeah, who did what and how did they do it? That's a really tricky question. First of all, if you really want to dig into the results of the research that I did when Kelly Weisskopf asked me those questions, maybe 2 years ago now, I have my website address here where I have put everything that I got from my research into this process. I guess it's worth foregrounding. My master's degree is in fiction writing, and my artistic practice is as a printmaker and as a publisher. So I don't come to this as a scholar. I come to this as a practitioner from a number of different perspectives. So when you see a book like this, and it's got an author and it's got a publisher, and it was printed in 1893, then there's a whole bunch of like material stuff that sits underneath it. So the book was printed at the Hartford Dayspring, which was the newspaper in Hartford where both Senius Engel and Simon Pokagon lived. And the Dayspring is a rural printing operation. And so what I did was I just went through the Dayspring, the digitized copies of the Dayspring newspaper published at the Hartford Dayspring, and I just read everything about their printing equipment, everything about Pokagon, and everything about Senius Engel from 1880 through till about 1960, when those names started to drop off in the collection. And this slide, for example, gives us a kind of indication of what I was looking at. So the print operation, we don't have a list of the equipment that they had in 1893, is the short answer. We can infer based on the material how they would have done it, but we don't have a list. But they went through a bunch of renovations at the early 20th century, and this article is a good example of that, where they bought new equipment and they proudly proclaimed the new equipment that they bought. And as they were proclaiming their new equipment, they told us about the stuff they were getting rid of, which allows us to kind of infer what was there in 1893, what exactly they had. And so, that is the process by which I went through and discovered how they did what they did. If you go to the next slide, the other constraint, so once you have a list of the equipment that they've got, and the other thing you have to wonder is what's the material that they're using? Like, what do they actually have to work with? And so I also did some work with birch bark myself. This is an example of a print that I did for my quarterly while I was exploring the material. And I guess I just want to say up front, birch bark is really hard to work with. It's like materially very challenging to work with. To make the individual pages is challenging. And then to print on it is very challenging. You can see here, I am very bad at working with birch bark. I have very, very limited skills with working with birch bark. And part of that is that the surface is very irregular. I mean, if we come back to part of the things that Blaire was talking about intentionality, and we want to answer this question of who did what, you have to really want to print on birch bark to print on birch bark. It's not a good material to print on. When you're printing on paper, the variations across the surface of a sheet of paper in 1893 are, you measure that with like a micrometer, with a caliper, just tiny little variations. But like the variations on this particular piece of birch bark, as an example, are millimeters of variation, which are just gigantic variations. Like, I damaged the type that I've used here to print on it. Luckily, I can make more of this type, but they would have damaged their type quite a lot. You get these different surface levels and thicknesses and densities in the material, and you take the relatively soft lead type and you ding it up quite substantially. This, I think, actually tells us something as to why across the Red Man's Rebuke there are multiple versions of the cover. For example, we see different pieces of type being used at different points in the edition, and clearly they were breaking type as they were doing it. When you scale this up, not just to the individual sheet, but then you say, and I don't remember exactly what the edition size was, but I believe it was a couple hundred. It's 28 pages for just the Red Man's Rebuke. And if you have, say, 400 copies in the edition, that's like 11,000 individual sheets. So producing that amount of material is a huge constraint. So you've got the material, you've got the equipment on one side, and you got the birch bark on the other. And so if you go to the next slide, we could talk about the three kinds of presses they had in the shop. Well, actually, first, this is metal type. Just to pause on it, based on an analysis of the actual type in the book, which is, I specifically looked at the Red Man's Rebuke. It's pretty clear that they were buying their handset type. I guess I'll pause. Handset type means, as you can see here, individual letters, individual spaces are being set piece by piece by piece by a compositor, a skilled craftsman at the Dayspring. So it would have required one or more long-time typesetters at the Dayspring. We won't go back to the previous slide, but in the first slide, when you saw that 1908 article about buying new equipment, in the headline, there's a little black rectangle in front of one of the letters. That's a space, one individual space that has risen up in the line and printed when they were printing that newspaper, which means that in 1908, they were still hand setting letter by letter the entire newspaper, which by 1908, most places have switched over to the linotype, which we don't have to go into that, but that was a lot easier to do. The fact that they were doing all of that hand set work with their newspapers indicates that they had a very skilled composition staff, even though they were making errors because they were doing so much typesetting, but they were doing a lot of typesetting. So they were buying their type from Chicago, from a foundry named Barnard Brothers and Spindler. And I can, again, on my website, you can see that there are certain letters like that capital T in the Red Man's Rebuke. That capital T is clearly a piece of type that was sold by BB&S in 1890 or so. So that's where they were getting their material. I guess there's a little bit of a sidetrack here on terms of the printing type. Engel, the publisher, had published books of his own, and his brother, Washington, had also published books of his own, and they had had things hand set and then had those handset things turned into stereotype plates. So maybe the Red Man's Buick was printed from stereotype plates, but the start of it was still handset type like this. All right, if we move to the next slide. So this is the main kind of press that they would have had at the Dayspring. It's a cylinder newspaper press. It's about the size of a minivan. And while we know they had it because they replaced it several times at the beginning of the 20th century, I'll just foreground, I don't believe that this is the press that was used, but it's important to look at it to realize why it wasn't used. It prints the newspaper full sheet. So it takes that full mother sheet and takes that whole sheet in and then prints it against the form. You can see on the bed of this press underneath the cylinder, that's where all the type is. The entire body of the newspaper is laid out there. So if you think about a newspaper fully unfolded, all of that type is laying there on that metal bed. But newspaper presses, as they take in the paper, they require very thin, very durable, and very uniform sheets of paper. You would never be able, based on my experience, to produce a single sheet of birch bark this size. And even if you could produce one, you would not be able to produce the hundreds necessary in order to produce a book. So like a cylinder press like this is very efficient. It takes in huge sheets, prints multiple pages at once. It's probably automated, even in 1890. They would have had all kinds of ways to make this really fast. It is probably not the press that they use. So if we go to the next slide, this is probably the first press that they had at the Dayspring. They list a Washington iron hand press in one of the historical documents associated with the Dayspring as being one of the earliest presses that they would have used. Like the newspaper press, it can print a pretty big sheet size, about half the size or maybe slightly less than half the size of that newspaper press. But for anybody who's ever seen one of these in operation, like if you've been to the Henry Ford Museum and you've seen one of these operating, they're very slow. So again, maybe you could have printed, I think primarily they would have cut the sheets to their page size, because when you work with the material, that's the easiest way to get good sheets consistently, to cut them down, to remove the excess that isn't printable, and to take a subset of all the material you've got and get those sheet sizes. So this is a press that could have done that. But, you know, given that they were printing, again, if you're going to print 11,000 sheets, which is if it was an edition of 400 or whatever, it would have taken them forever. The typesetting would have been done, but they would have been printing, they would have never made their deadline. So if we go to the final slide here, this is the press that I think they used. They had what was called a small jobbing press, quote unquote. That's all they say. They didn't identify the brand, but this is a Prouty jobber from 1888. This is actually one of the presses that I own. It's sitting right next to me right now, actually. And it is one of a variety of jobbing presses that would have been common at the time. And you can see it's got a big flywheel on one side, and it's got a treadle that is a foot pedal at the bottom. So if you've ever used a very old 19th century sewing machine, you have a sense of how this press operates. You would use the treadle to drive it, and it would semi-automatically run through its rotation. As we're looking at this press here static, the type would have been upright on the back of the press, and then the paper would have been fed here into the front, and it's a clamshell operation. And so as it goes through its rotations, the press opens, you feed the sheet into the front, you got the type over here, you've got this, the circular plate on top is where the ink is reservoired. The ink rollers come down off of that plate, come down onto the type, and then the type closes onto the piece of paper, and then it opens, and then you draw the sheet out. And one press operator could have easily produced 1,000 prints in an hour off of this thing. So once you'd had the typesetting done, producing your editions would have been the work of a couple of days to just do the sheets. One of the other nice things about a press like this that I think is useful for our understanding of how the book is printed is you can adjust the thickness of the material that you're printing on. So in addition to printing on paper, they printed yardsticks on 1/8-inch wood. Wood laminate could be printed very easily on this. So the idea of printing on birch bark, this is the press they absolutely would have used. It's the right sheet size. So, you know, the birch bark books are, you know, about 5 by 7, I think, roughly. That's, especially for this particular press, that's exactly the sheet size that it would take. You'd have to hand feed it, but that's, you know, that's the materiality of how they've made it. And I hope I didn't rush through those slides too quickly, but it's to kind of get that whole scope of how it worked. I guess I'll pause there. And, as far as who did what, it seems to me that having an author deliver a text to a publisher, having the publisher then contract with a printer, there's a lot of steps in there. The typesetter would have had to have had a standard piece of manuscript to work with. And so it makes sense that it would have to pass through multiple hands. Pokagon passing it to Engel passing it to the printer passing it to the compositor doing the typesetting, then the press operator, and then it coming back out with bound books.
I love how the two of you have given us this bigger picture. And I really appreciate that. And I know that Paul has some things to add to the conversation, as well as the Q&A containing questions from the audience. So just before we have Paul lead the Q&A interspersed with his observations and questions, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping things and mention that our centennial exhibit, this is the last day to see it in person. So anyone who's on campus or in the area who's interested has until 4 o'clock to see it in person. But we also do have an online version. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out, I hope you will. We this week saw some of the people who are on this program and are regulars who live in the area at our Adopt a Piece of History Fest, and we really appreciated that opportunity. I wanted to let everybody know that if you're interested, we have our various sponsorships of items at the Clements available online as well, and that they make great holiday gifts. The December Bookworm is the Clements and the Rosenbach, the intertwined histories of 2 great American libraries. And we're really excited to let you know that when you sign up for the Bookworm, you receive a reminder monthly and can choose to participate in person, or you'll receive an email the afternoon of the Bookworm with a link to the recording and all the resources mentioned. So this will be a great conversation with our friends from the Rosenbach in conversation with Paul Erickson and Maggie Vanderford. And so I hope that you'll consider joining us again. And with that, I'll also thank the Alumni Association of the University of Michigan once again for sponsoring today's Bookworm. And if you're interested in any conversations about future sponsorships or gifts, you can always contact myself or Ann Bennington-Helber. Okay, with that, I'll stop sharing and turn it back over to Paul.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. And thank you, Blaire and Fritz. This was really fantastic. So I have no thoughts to share. I just have a couple questions, and then we'll dive into the questions we have in the Q&A. And Blaire, you touched a bit on the fact that this sort of art and souvenir market was already functioning by this point in the late 19th century. So do either of you have a sense of sort of whose idea was it to print these books on birch bark? Was this something that Pokagon was invested in doing? Did Engel have the idea of like, oh, this is, there's this market out there for things printed on birch bark, and it's something that you can make money selling? Do you have a sense of how that decision happened?
So that's a great question. And Fritz, I think you have some interesting things to say about Cineas Engel, but yeah, so there's a few different things. Yes, this market already exists, and we also see places like Bayview and other places in Michigan becoming larger tourist sites and places where white Americans spend their summers. And prior to Simon Pokagon's Birch Bark Books, we have Phineas Engel's brother, who actually publishes a similar Birch Bark booklet called with a really bad poem in it called Bayview the Beautiful. And even Simon takes a few lines from this poem, and I don't have it right in front of me to get the exact words right, but within it, the brother Engel talks about how beautiful this site is, and how thankful he is that loggers and other developers had spared this site for the use of our enjoyment and things like that. And Simon very clearly takes what he says, changes it a little bit, but refuses to be grateful. In fact, he says, this is where he laments the loss of some of the trees because of this logging and such. So I wouldn't say that it was Engel's idea to publish on Birch Bark. Certainly they both knew each other very closely. And because we have the use of this birch bark for thousands of years, it definitely wouldn't have been a new approach to documenting stories onto a piece of birch bark paper. But I think I'd like to turn it over to Fritz, because you have a really interesting take on the ways that Engel kind of aligned himself with Indigenous communities at this time, but certainly answer in any way that you feel appropriate. Oh, you're muted though.
Welcome to the 21st century, everybody. Yes, that's good. Yeah, no, I find this question fascinating. I mean, I think first and foremost is you can't know. You just can't know. But there are things you can say. And again, just going through the newspapers, the Bayview story for Engel is quite interesting. He's a founding member of the Bayview Methodist vacation community up in Petoskey. And he features prominently in the newspaper up there, which is called the Daily Resorter. And so I have a whole section at the bottom of my website on that page where I've done this research that kind of links to those articles. And he maintained a selling space called the Bazaar, where he seems to have sold a number of items he starts going up there in 1888. The other part, as far as his relationship with the Indigenous community vis-a-vis his business that Blaire refers to, is that when you read his account of Allegan County history, one of the very first things Phineas does when he arrives is he notices and identifies Indigenous communities and the work they're doing, and I won't characterize it. He's interested in what they're doing. For example, there's a large amount of berry picking. He tells a story from the 1850s, I believe, where he identifies a large community of Indigenous women who are collecting berries around a lake. And he realizes that there's an arbitrage opportunity, and he buys the berries for them for pennies on the dollar, and then he ships them out first to Chicago, and then eventually starts shipping them out to New York City. And his first couple of shipments are so bad, the berries are all crushed in the process, that it was said that people bought more flies than berries, but he still made quite a lot of money. In fact, he's able to build an opera house in Hartford, this tiny little town in Michigan, based on the surplus revenue that he gets from these large purchases that he makes from Indigenous people. So when you get to the birch bark, he writes a lot about how beautiful the birch bark work is by the women in that community. He has, he writes, this is Engel, writes a number of times about his respect for and love of the craft work that they do. And my experience with the material says there's no way that a non-expert produces the quantities of good birch bark in order to make this book. And Engel has this long history of going to the Indigenous community. And I guess to be fair to Engel, briefly, I think from his point of view, trying to pay them what he thinks is a fair rate. Obviously, he makes a huge amount of money, and from our perspective, it's clearly exploitative. But he tries to pay them a fair rate as he sees it. And he has a long history of just purchasing material from them and then selling it, basically taking Indigenous labor and then selling it in white communities for big markup. And that when you have the sales operation that he has up at Bayview, I think it makes sense. But as far as what that says about authorship, as far as what that says about whose idea, I'm not sure that that's an easily sussed out thing. Like, I look at Engel as being like an almost perfect vehicle. Like, if you come and you're like, I want to speak in my voice as an Indigenous author and I want to communicate to white people, Engel's a pretty good partner. He has a deep relationship with the publisher. He has a deep experience collecting material and paying for material from Indigenous craftspeople. He's got a lot of surplus money just kicking around in terms of investment capital to like take a big risk on a big project. You know, especially when you hear Blaire's discussion and the Pokagon band's kind of broader communal discussion about who Simon Pokagon was, what his relationship was to all these different communities. I think that, you know, if we flip the terms, Engel is an almost perfectly exploitable white man. Like, he is a person who has all these skills, all these capacities, and doesn't really have anything to do with it. He doesn't seem like, his brother wants to be a writer, but Engel doesn't seem to ever really have any interest in producing his own material. And yeah, Washington, one of the last things we get from Washington is in 1936, the guy who buys the pharmacy after Washington has passed away, he has to pulp all of Washington's bad poetry books. There's like 500 copies of Washington's last book of poetry, and they get sold to a scrap dealer for the paper because Washington has invested all this energy and all this creativity in these writings and nobody wants it. Whereas clearly Pokagon's work sells, and Engel, who doesn't really have a writing ambition, but just wants to make money, I don't know. That's where you get into like fiction writing and speculating about personalities. But yeah, that would be my answer to that question.
So I just have one other question. You know, thinking in light of the fact that there was kind of a souvenir / art market for things printed on birch bark, do either of you have a sense for how the fact that these books were printed on birch bark influenced their reception, and particularly for Blaire, since Pokagon seems to have kind of maybe a controversial reputation? How did the fact that he was selling things printed on birch bark, that, you know, material that was gathered using native knowledge, do you have a sense of how that affected how people in the native community thought about him?
Only that certainly they had an effect, because we have to remember that the other 3 titles were published in 1901, which is after his death. So they're published and they are sold in locations that are already ingesting tourists. We see in some of the birch bark some indications about where they can be purchased in places like South Haven, for example. And so we know people are reading them, especially women are reading them and remarking on how it's changed their view of Native peoples more generally, especially because both within The Queen of the Woods, which is his novel, as well as in The Red Man's Rebuke, he laments how alcohol has affected his community and the sort of other negative effects of American expansion into that area, which was really taken up by temperance advocates, especially women. So their draw to Simon Pokagon's text is probably through that connection, and seeing like, okay, with similar politics and we're going to advance this discussion. And for a similar reason, I think that's why so many people are drawn to the Rebuke and drawn to Ogimakwe Mittagwaki, because of this. Is definitely more palatable to American readers then and now, and how largely Algonquian legends, both of Paw Paw Lake and South Haven, as well as Potawatomi Book of Genesis, I think that non-natives didn't know what to do with that, because here was this text that even with Rebuke, that's very, you can say, kind of radical for the time, and it's really, you know, sticking it to American society, which you could say would put off a lot of people, and probably it did. But I think because it centers American society, American readers liked that, and oh, it's about me, you know. And so, whereas the legends, as well as Genesis, are just some stories, right? There are some traditional stories, and I don't think readers knew what to do with that. And it centers Indigenous thought and Indigenous attachments to place and ideas about the future. And so I'm hoping to amplify that a little bit. But I know I got away from your question a little bit, but hopefully I answered.
No, that's
I mean,
great.
one thing I would add to that, and while I don't know a lot about the reception, here's one thing you can say. When Engel died, he had the plates for Queen of the Woods, the printing plates, because at that point, that was a whole long book that was printed on paper. And so they did do the stereotype process. They had the handset type, then turned probably through electrodepositing into electrodes or stereotype plates. So he had all the plates for the book in his basement. And at that time when he died, nobody wanted them. So there was nobody in the community, and he would have, obviously being a lawyer for the Pokagon band, if anybody was gonna, if Indigenous people in the area were gonna know about any printing plates, they would have known about his printing plates of this important book. And they can't find anybody to take them, and so they get scrapped for metal price. Again, it's in the newspaper, it's spoken of sadly, but it speaks to the communal ambivalence, however you want to describe it. Like, you can't get into people's minds, but definitely at the time of his death, this is a huge, significant, you could have, even if you just cared about the book, this would have been the only way to reproduce it. The only way to make new editions of it would be to print from the plates. So whenever you see plates being disposed of in that way at that time, it is the absolute death of that book in terms of the community that cared about it. Like, they didn't want to make new ones. They didn't care.
So there are a couple questions in the Q&A about how many of these birch bark books survive today. And I want to mention that the Clements Library does not have any of these, any of Pokagon's birch bark books in our collection. We have other things printed on birch bark, but the copies that exist at the University of Michigan are in the Special Collections Library and at the Bentley. So how many of them exist now, and are there places where people can see them?
Certainly. So with regard to the number, we don't know. If you look on WorldCat and search the catalogs, you'll find about 30, I think, copies of the Rebuke. I can't recall if the Potawatomi Book of Genesis is included in that number or not, but that's an easy way to get a sort of idea about how many are at least accessioned in institutions. But we also know that plenty of these materials, this ephemera, exists in private collection as well. The Douglas Fisher collection that I mentioned, from which this volume comes, was in private collection all the way up until 2016 when it was sold to the tribe. So there's an unknown number out there somewhere. And yes, you can see digitizations of the full cover to cover versions of Rebuke and Potawatomi Book of Genesis from a number of institutions. I'm thinking Newberry Library for sure, but on the Pokagon Band Archives website, Wheelquebjigan, you can see digitizations of all 4 of the birch bark books, including the Legends and Genesis. What was the final thing I wanted to say? Oh, also on that website, we have recordings of language speakers and elders who are reading those stories. So if you'd like to hear what some of the words Simon uses sound like, which was a sort of big barrier to entry for a lot of people, that would be a good resource to check out.
Thank you. So Tom has a question. So white birch trees do not grow everywhere in North America. So are the practices of both using birch bark as a format to write down traditional oral stories and then later to print birch bark books, are they unique to the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes, the Northeast, or is it a more widespread practice?
I say it's more widespread because we have not only the movement of our villages traditionally, seasonal rotations of things, but also extensive trade networks. And so even Simon talks about how he's experiencing environmental change and seeing less and less of these white birch trees further south, that even today, if you talk to any sort of like climate scientists or just natural resource management professionals, they will say that the sort of growth margin for where these birch trees are still existing is getting more and more north and in a smaller area, because we know climate change is affecting it. And so yeah, I think that answers the question.
So Tim has a question. We've answered part of it about how many copies exist, but can you talk a bit about some of the handwritten documents on birch bark that were produced before Pokagon had these books printed? What kinds of things did they tend to record, and how many of those types of documents still exist in collections?
I can't really answer that question. I can say that well, I can't say how many. That's always a difficult one, right? But the sort of materials that you see are, of course, birch bark scrolls, which a lot of times contain ceremonial information. They're usually part of larger bundles, and they have pictographs etched on them, which tell really long stories. Sometimes they even serve as maps. And if you know how to read them, you can relay the stories. And so these were usually collected by anthropologists, and I would say definitely fall under something that would be defined by NAGPRA as sacred, and therefore up for repatriation. And so you'll tend to have Native peoples like not be super happy with them being photographed or digitized online. But certainly they still remain in collections around the world somewhere.
Great. So Cheryl asked a question about stereotyping, and you've talked about this a bit already, Fritz, but can you, for people who are not, don't spend a lot of time in print shops, can you talk just a little bit about how stereotyping worked, and sort of what level of skill and knowledge was needed to do it? And then sort of, you talked a bit about storing the plates. Like how much room did you need to store a set of plates for a book the size of
yeah. Well, it's a big complicated question. So, you're printing, you have a relief surface, and normally you're producing that with metal type, which is like individual pieces of type, or you've got a carved piece of wood that you're printing from. So for example, the image of Chicago that's at the front of the Red Man's Rebuke, which Blaire had asked, that's probably printed from a stereotype. That would have been originally a wood engraving, but then in order to make a durable printing surface, there's two different ways that a stereo would have been made. And by the way, stereotype, this is where we get the word stereotype from that we now use in many different other contexts. But the basic idea is you're wanting to make a metal duplicate that's a single sheet of the printing surface. So say you've got a wood engraving. One way is to take basically paper mache or a kind of paper mache-like material and press it in a very heavy etching press down onto that surface, and then letting it dry and creating a relief. And then you can cast a metal plate from that, often in type metal. So that's a stereotype, and that would be usually made in softer lead-based type metal. More likely, though, they were going to make copper electrodes, which is another stereotyping process. There were a number of electro companies in Chicago at the time that would have been affiliated on Printers Row with BB&S. And so electrotyping, what is the simplest way to, you're going to suspend your material in a solution that is saturated with metal, and then you're going to hook electrodes up to either side of the material, and you're going to allow the solutionized, that's not a word, but the metal in solution is going to deposit. It's going to electrically deposit onto the surface and slowly build up, and you're going to get a copy of your printing surface that way. And again, you'll cast it in lead, and then you'll electrodeposit metal on top of that, and yeah, there's a whole thing there. But you're going to make it out of lead and copper, and that's going to give you a much more durable printing surface. So there's a number of reasons to do it. One of them is because it's durable. It's more durable to have a copper printing surface than a metal type printing surface. But it is actually space efficient. So if you have a whole book built up in metal type, the type is 1 inch thick. So that's going to be, a 28-page booklet is going to fill up, well, it's going to fill up at least 28 galleys. So it's going to be, 4 feet tall. It's going to fill up your space. Whereas the metal type, the stereotypes are thinner plates, so they're only about 1/4 of an inch thick, and you can stack them. So you can take a whole 300-page book and put it in the same space as you would put a 28-page type form. I don't think that they were printing from stereotype for the birch bark books, though, because I think that the damage ratio would have been too high. It's easier to replace individual letters from your own set of letters than to have a new plate made. And so the risk of damaging the plates, except for the images, but you'll notice the images are really badly printed. They're almost illegible in most of the prints. They were being very gentle with those plates. They were not trying to get the best print. They were trying to make sure that the plates survived. That's my view. There's more that I could say, but I won't.
Yeah, and just one other thing that I would add is that from the authorship standpoint, if you have stereotype plates, there comes the question of who owns those plates. And so for authors, owning your stereotype plates is kind of like musicians in the 20th century owning their master recordings. Like if you own plates to your publications, you can arrange with different printers to have them reissued, and you can make a lot more money. In fact, Longfellow was famous for sort of being a pioneer.
I mean, especially speaking of that and speaking of these questions of authorship, it would be very interesting to know if there was any documentation vis-a-vis Engel and the community, because obviously almost all of this material is being produced after Pokagon dies. But clearly he made plates for Queen of the Woods, and he had possession of them. We have that documentary evidence, but he was a lawyer. So it's plausible that there's documentary evidence to say who owned it. He might have kept records of that. But that's another kind of deep dive into an archive that isn't in the newspaper.
Right. So one final question from Tom, and I think it ties in well with Blaire's next book project. So Tom wonders, did Pokagon see a changing evolution over time of Potawatomi culture and worldview, or was he strictly concerned with chronicling the past? And sort of, maybe if you can talk a bit about how you see this set of books that he wrote and created feeding into the question of Indigenous futurity.
Well, absolutely saw a lot of changes happening in the 19th century. We have the proliferation of community members being baptized. I can't speculate about their motivations for such, but certainly in the face of removal or else being baptized would have seemed pretty attractive to stay in your homelands. But also he talks explicitly about the changes that occurred throughout his lifetime. And I would say he's not super interested in chronicling the past. I think he's drawing from the past in the ways that were important foundations for Anishinaabe identity and politics and kinship relations, essentially everything that makes up what would have been values at that time, and wanting to, deploy them to future generations, because we also know that Native peoples were reading his texts as well. It wasn't just, publications for American society to kind of have a victim narrative or something. So so it does kind of draw into my next book project, even though I don't really talk explicitly about Simon, but kind of in ways that collapse time in order to mobilize to better, more desired futures, I think is a big project throughout history, not just for Pokagon, Potawatomi peoples, but for Anishinaabe or Indigenous folks in a lot of places.
Well, Blaire, Fritz, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a great conversation. Angela, I will turn things back over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. This was wonderful. And I really appreciate everything that you've shared with us today. And thank you to all of our wonderful listeners who asked such good questions as well. And have a great weekend, everyone.